what we're going to do in this session is provide an overview of social and cultural patterns among Latinos in Boulder County, spanning the whole range between 1900 and 1980. We'll be looking at 6 different topics. Divided between 2 sections. So I'm going to talk for 15 minutes, then we'll have an activity, and then another set of these pairs. So the topics we're going to consider are in the first group that I'll talk about right now, discuss families and the key stages or events in people's lives, and then food, health, and medicine. In the second chunk, we will look at housing and neighborhoods, and then social life, entertainment, and sports. And in the final one, we'll talk about religion and education. So let's jump right in now to families. Latino families throughout the whole span of time we're considering have been, in general, closely knit. People spent a lot of time with their relatives, they cared about them, and that included not just their immediate family who lived in the same house with them, but their extended families. The people were in close contact across generations and with their aunts and uncles, with their cousins, with a large number of relatives. Those human ties and the kind of support that they gained from their families and that they gave within their families was a very important component of Latino family life. Something that emerges very strongly from the interviews that have been done, both the ones done in the 1970s and then more recent ones, is the importance of grandparents. Children often grew up living near their grandparents, knowing their grandparents, caring about their grandparents. For the grandparents as well, for the older people, being in touch with the younger generation was a great source of pleasure. They did a lot of teaching of the younger children, and often if the intermediate generation, that is the parents' generation, if they were off working, much of the responsibility for looking after the younger children and training them, bringing them up well, would fall to the grandparents. So that's a contrast with many Anglo families where the gap was greater between the grandparents' generation and that of the next 2 down. Another feature that turns up in the interviews is the extent to which fathers were involved with their children. The discussions that people describe of their own childhoods indicate that they spent time with their fathers interacted with them when they were not at work, they did things together, the fathers sang, they told stories, they were very much involved in their children's lives. That is a contrast with the sort of popular contemporary image of what it means to be macho, what it means to be a good man. In traditional society, earlier in this century, and to some extent even now, the term macho had quite a different meaning among Latinos themselves. A man who was macho was a good provider for his family in economic terms. He was good to his wife, and he spent time with his children. He was there for his family. He was also supposed to be a respected member of the community. People would look up to him. He had good ideas. He was responsible and dependable. Those meanings of macho, which go way back, those are quite different from the media-produced image that we have nowadays, which is some young guy swaggering around with a lot of attitude, wearing sort of grungy black clothes. That idea of macho was not part of the original idea. Now, it is true that even within the earlier conception, there was a slightly darker flip side of the meaning of macho. And this is one that many Chicana activists during the 60s and 70s, and to some extent ever since, have objected to. That is, being a good, strong male could also mean being very dominating within the family. It could also mean that the man expected that he would make all the decisions for the family without involving his wife. So that idea of a controlling man could also be linked to the original idea of macho. We have lots of family photos, so these become a wonderful source for teaching, including for younger children who are not yet good readers or for English language learners. This photograph, for example, takes us back to northern New Mexico. These are the grandparents of a family that ended up in Longmont. That would have been in the years right around 1900. Or we have this photo of the Arroyo family in Boulder. The Arroyos got to know a German photographer, an immigrant photographer, and he spent a lot of time with them and took a series of marvelous photos. So these are the Arroyos at Chautauqua Park on a picnic in the 1940s. Or how about this for a nice image? I love this picture. This shows 5 generations of women within one family. The woman on the right, upper right, is Eleanor Montour, who is the important community figure who led the tour that the History Project produced of Lafayette, historic places in Lafayette. In the middle is her mother, Alicia Sanchez, after whom an elementary school in Lafayette was named. She was the founder of the Clinica Campesina for farm workers and eventually for lots of families living in the Lafayette area. This is a picture of a man we know quite a lot about. He was interviewed several times. We have many other photos of him. His name is Secundina Herrera. And I like this photo because it's just such a natural family-looking snapshot. He looks so comfortable holding the baby. The 2 girls look so pleased that there the baby is trying to blow out his birthday candles. And to me, this is a nice representation of just male comfort at being with his father's children. In Latino families, as in all families, there tended to be certain ceremonies or special practices to commemorate key transitions or stages in people's lives. And here again, we have quite a lot of information. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it now. We know about birth patterns and the raising of children. This is quite a nice little slide of a pair of babies being washed in a tub at home, and you notice the workman's lunch pail down on the floor beside them. And then as we move on, we have more information about childhood, lots of pictures of kids doing different sorts of things, and of teenagers. Marriage was a big ceremony. People wanted to have a wedding party, so there would be the mass at church, but then there should be a celebration at home. Sometimes these went on for several days. If ever you're going to have a picture taken, it is of your wedding. So of these 850 family photos we have, a lot of them are wedding photos. And again, they cover a big range. So that one is a wedding photo taken in southern Colorado in the 1910s of a couple who had just moved up from northern New Mexico. Or then we have very much more elaborate wedding photos. This is a woman, the marriage of John Martinez with Emma Gomez Martinez. Emma Gomez Martinez later became the most important single community leader in Boulder during the period of the Office of Economic Opportunity. Last year, Canyon Park in Boulder was renamed in her honor. So this is Emma Gomez Martinez's wedding in the 50s. So, and then burial. We don't have pictures of burials, but we have a lot of interview material about burials. Children were not spared from the reality of death. They were taken to wakes, they were taken to funerals, they were taken to burials. And again, this is the final stage in the sequence of commemoration of life transitions about which we have information. So we can now move to the second topic, which concerns food and then the closely related issues of health and medicine. As you may know, food and cooking together and eating together form important parts of Latino culture. They're something that binds families together. There are often special foods that you make for particular events. So even families that have been here for 3 and 4 generations might, for instance, gather together on Christmas Eve or the day before Christmas to make tamales for Christmas. All of the family will come back in, everybody helps make them. For people who were living on limited incomes, food tended to be quite simple. It would include a lot of tortillas, beans, vegetables from the gardens that they grew. People hoped to have chickens and eggs that they produced themselves. But it was a very healthy but fairly basic diet on a normal basis. But for special events, then if the family could afford it, they would buy extra supplies and cook meals that were considered for their family to be particularly important and particularly delicious. So a number of older women within the families were famed for their recipes. They were particularly good at cooking this or that. Or the interviews talk about the abuelita who had a magic red bowl in her kitchen. Everything she cooked from that bowl was delicious. Health was related to cooking because until the 60s and 70s, very few Latinas in Boulder County, Latinos, made use of Western medicine. Most healing, most care for people who were sick, most remedies were provided at home. And often it was the same women who had the wonderful stock of recipes who also had a particular range of remedios, of remedies that they were known for. These came frequently, again, from their gardens or from wild herbs or plants. We now know, thanks to lots of scientific research, that many of those remedies which they were using were indeed filled with qualities that are still recognized as being medicinally important. It was senior women in the family, the grandmothers, who often were the repositories of knowledge about remedies. They were the same people who were famed for their cooking. In terms of Western medicine, doctors were expensive. There might not be any doctor living near where you were living. And some people felt embarrassed, especially of having women be treated by an Anglo-white doctor, male doctor. So people seldom went to doctors. Most babies were born at home. Progressively, people began to have their babies in a hospital if there was some kind of a problem. But normally, babies were born at home, often helped by a midwife, curandera, someone who was familiar with with how to help mothers go through their labor and deliver the baby safely. It was only in the 1970s that you get large numbers, any significant number of Latinos going into the field of medicine as practitioners. The first people to go in were nurses, beginning in the 60s, and then by 1980, we're just beginning to see a few Latino males going to medical school. But that was a slow process. Up until that time, we need to think of medical care as happening primarily at home and at the hands of people within the family or the neighborhood who had these particular skills. So we'll stop now. Oh no, I forgot. I wanted to show you Clofes. In 2012, a group of Boulder families put on a special exhibit about their relatives. And they put together pictures with a text, and this is one of them. This shows Clofes Archuleta, who lived in the area in Boulder in which many other Latino families lived. And this describes her skill at making clothing, her skill at cooking, her skill at preserving and canning fruits and vegetables, and her own homemade remedios for headaches, upset stomachs, other matters of that sort. So these women were then highly respected and honored within their family. It would be true for many Latinas that when you could afford it, putting on a special meal to the family was a wonderful thing. It might be that most of the time you ate beans and tortillas. You lived very simply on a diet that was in which you could grow a lot of what you ate. You had a vegetable garden, you had chickens and eggs. But when it was possible to have something special, that was a wonderful moment. It was something that brought families together. So Clofes was an example of somebody who had now, that family had moved into Boulder, they had a little more money, her husband was working with a regular paid job, and she had two sons who were working, and so she really was a homemaker with a sort of a capital H, and that she had the resources as well as the intelligence and the time and the skills to produce these marvelous meals that not just her own family, but all of the neighbors in them as well. We're now going to have the third session of this afternoon's presentation, which deals with religion and education. Starting with religion, it is the case that all the way through the 20th century, virtually all Latinos in Boulder County would have defined themselves as Roman Catholics. But the extent to which they were involved with their parish churches, the extent to which they interacted with people at the church, varied a great deal over time. Between 1900 and 1940, most Latinos in this area were not going to church regularly and were not considered regular members of the parish congregation. Partly this was because of their working and living circumstances. They often had to work 7 days a week. They were not free to go to church on Sundays. On top of that, transportation was limited. If you were at a mining camp somewhere, or if you were a farm worker, you might be a long way away from the nearest church, because the churches were in the towns. So how would you even get to church if you wanted to go there? On top of that, the Catholic churches in Boulder County were not welcoming to Latinos. They were segregated in terms of their seating. Latinos sat in their own sections, away from Anglos. The services were in Latin, and there were no Spanish-speaking priests. So the sermons were not available to people who spoke only Spanish. There was no one to whom you could go for confession in Spanish. In most cases, therefore, families practiced their religion at home, within the family circle. Once again, the key figures were commonly the senior woman in the family. She's the one who sat everybody down and made them say the rosaries. She's the one who insisted upon prayers at regular points during the religious year. She's the one who educated the younger children in whatever training in catechism they got, simply through her own knowledge. Many women had an altar at home, which would be often just a bureau in one corner of a room, which would have the santos, the saints, any other religious images on the top of it. They commonly would decorate their altars with flowers. They were a place of focusing home-based worship. Beginning around 1940, and especially after World War II, that began to change because Latinos became more involved in their parishes, in their parish church activities, for a variety of reasons. For one thing, more people were now moving into the towns, so they were physically closer. Working conditions improved somewhat, so they might be allowed a half a day off to go to church. Even families living farther out might now have cars or trucks, so they could come to church. Equally important, however, was a change within the churches themselves. Segregated seating in the churches began to break down, and it's commented on by several of our interview materials and the historic videos we made of the towns, that you could find Latinos and Anglos sitting next to each other now, in the 60s, for instance. That had not been the case before. As a part of the Chicano activist movement in the later 60s and 70s, Chicanos pushed in the area of religion, as they did in the area of education, treatment of Latinos by the police, and in many other fields of life. They felt that there should be services in Spanish in the churches, and they felt there should be Spanish-speaking priests who could hear confession. As a result of that pressure coming from the Latino community itself, the churches gradually during the 70s, and more so during the 80s, began to hire Spanish-speaking priests. This made a big difference to Latinos. So church enrollments, church involvement went way up as the churches committed themselves to having Spanish-speaking priests. And again, in the interviews, people often say, oh, it means so much to me that I can now go to Mass and I can hear Father so-and-so telling me the Mass in my language. And when there's a sermon, I know what it's talking about. So this was a significant change in terms of their interaction and involvement with the Catholic churches in the 3 towns we're looking at. If there's one time in life that produces more photos than weddings, it is probably First Communion. So we have many, dozens of photos of children receiving their First Communion, all of them quite charming. And we find also a photo of the one Catholic nun from this area who remained active locally. And this is Sister Rosa Suazo, who comes from a big family originally of field workers. And she went to St. John's Catholic School in Longmont and joined the Order of the Sisters of St. Francis when she was 16. She spent much of her life of her religious life in Milwaukee, but then asked to be transferred back. So she came back to Longmont and remained in the community. She's still active. She's retired from the church, but she's still an active person in her late 80s, very much admired, very much beloved. But to me, the curious thing is that we only know of one other person who became a nun, and she didn't stay in the area. So out of all of these Latino families, we know then really of at most 2 nuns and no priests. Now that to me was surprising because my own background is largely Irish, and within Irish families it was a matter of great pride for immigrant families to have a son who joined the priesthood or a daughter who became a nun. So virtually every big Irish family wanted to have somebody in the church. That just does not seem to have happened here with Latino families, and I think it's because they were not made welcome by the churches. They were not given to feel they were part of the church, and therefore they did not identify with it in the sense of taking holy orders as they became adults. The final topic we're going to talk about now is education. And here we can very clearly and demonstrably dispel a myth, which is that Latinos are not interested in education. This is something that was said all through the century. We still hear it now in the 21st century. There's a great deal of evidence that Latino families who came to Boulder County did so in large part precisely so their children would be able to get a better education. They often talked about having a better life for their children, and they knew that to achieve a better life, a young person had to have had education. So parents were willing to keep their children in school even after they were old enough to have been working in the fields. Boys could start working in the coal mines when they were around 13. So the fact that parents and children kept them in education, even after they got older, even if they were in their late teens and early 20s, this demonstrates quantitatively how important education was. From the interview material and family biographies, we have lots of excellent stories that people tell us about how the immigrant parents spoke about it, why it was that they expected their children to be in school, why each generation then tended to go further in school. So this is a very powerful set of sources. If we turn to the quantitative information, we have a lot of very interesting material that comes from the annual school census books. So starting already by 1900 and continuing to 1964, every year each school had to fill out a booklet that listed all of the children at the school with their names, their parents' names, what grade they were in, how old they were, and often information about migration patterns. Where were they born? Where were their parents born? Were their parents literate? We, the Latino History Project, have had volunteers who have helped us go through these school census books, pulling out information about children with Latino surnames. So we've done that for each of the 3 towns, once a decade, starting in 1905 and continuing to 1964. These records have then been analyzed quantitatively, and they provide extremely powerful information about the number of Latino children in school and the number of families they came from. So if you compare, you can make a list then of all of the different families in a given decade that had Latino families, that had children in school, and compare that against the census records that tells us how many families there were in total. What emerges very clearly is that virtually every single Latino family had at least one child in school, and often 6, 7, 8 children in school. So here we have quantitative evidence to go along with the information from interviews and other sources that says education mattered. These quantitative sources are also excellent teaching materials for people who are doing math instruction. So for instance, you could have even fairly young children use them to start seeing how a spreadsheet works. How do you analyze numbers? How do you compare percents across one period to another period? So these are fine resources for that kind of teaching as well. The final point I'd like to mention in this session concerns the level of racism and discrimination that Latino children experienced at school. The problems and challenges that Latino children had to overcome at school make it even more impressive that they were willing to continue going for an education. They faced a number of different kinds of problems. They were almost always punished for speaking Spanish at school, even if that was the only language they knew. They had their names changed from their Spanish-based names to ones that seemed more English. Teachers often assumed that they were slow in one way or another. The teachers confused lack of ability in English with lack of intellectual ability. They were seen as dirty. And so if, for instance, there happened to be an outbreak of head lice, which was common in all schools across the period, the school commonly assumed that the head lice had been introduced by Latino children, and they were made to undergo special treatment that was different from the Anglo children. By the time the children got to middle school, junior high, and high school, the problems were often of a slightly different nature, which was not so much coming from the teacher in the school in any official way, but coming from the other kids. So Anglo children were often, they made fun of Latino children. They separated themselves socially. The Latino children sat at one table at lunch, in part because they were embarrassed that they were having tortillas and the Anglo kids were having sandwiches. So these kind of social tensions that occur between adolescent kids everywhere were magnified for the Latino children because the Anglo educational and social system was so predominant. There was really no clear place for them to assert a positive identity for themselves as Latinos. So we have to admire then the achievements of so many Latinos in getting an education and the commitment of so many parents to keep them in school right on through progressively until they had graduated from high school. So thank you. That finishes our presentation for this session.